Now that we've completed step 3, which was thesis development, we're ready for step 4 in the writing process guide. Step 4 is choosing evidence to support that thesis statement. So we're going to be selecting evidence that supports our reasons for believing our opinion or for our claim. You can see here that there are different types of evidence that we can use to support our claim. Here are 5 different examples of things that we might use. These pieces of evidence, your evidence that supports your claim, sometimes those can come from the additional sources that you've searched for on the library website. Sometimes those are stories or things that are personal to you, which would be a way of using pathos in your argument, or maybe stories of people that you know around you. Or they can even be scenarios, things that, for example, you're, painting a picture for your audience. But we're going to look here at the 5 different types of evidence that you may use to support your reasons. These pieces of evidence will be showing up in your body paragraphs for essay 4. The first type of evidence here is a fact or a statistic. That's where you would use something like, and all of these pieces of evidence are going to be related to if college is worth the cost. So if we look here, example, a 2014 study by the Economic Policy Institute estimated that people with a 4-year college degree earn 98% more per hour than those who did not finish a degree. The purpose of that evidence would be to prove that college graduates earn more money, and by using a fact or a statistic from a reputable study or a reputable source, that's something that may be used to convince audience that our opinion is worth believing. You can find facts or statistics here, that first type of evidence, again, in sources that you've searched for on the library database. The second would be a story or an anecdote. A story or an anecdote, an example would be Colleen Conroy took a gap year and discovered her true passion was for writing, not geology. So she switched her major and had a successful academic career. You would use a story or an anecdote to prove that a gap year might help a person find the right career path. Stories or anecdotes, again, this can come from sources that you found on the library site. So maybe an interview with someone, or a story, like, for example, in the Turkle readings where she discusses Roman or Maury. And it could also be a story or an anecdote from your own life or from someone that you know. So that doesn't necessarily have to come from an outside source. The third type of evidence is example. An example is like, to become a college web designer, a real estate agent, or a chef, you don't have to have a college degree. But having a degree won't prevent you from getting any of those jobs. On the other hand, you can't become a teacher, an accountant, a doctor, or an engineer without a degree. So you're giving some examples there that show, your examples show that a college degree increases a person's job options. Those, again, could come from things that are commonly known or familiar. This would be a way of incorporating logos in your arguments there, or logic. That can also, these sources may also come from, or this sort of evidence may come from sources that you find in the library. The next would be a quote, and that could be either from an expert or a non-expert. So, for example, now as a junior, I'm happier than ever. I am stimulated by my academic work and enthusiastic about my growth as a writer. Quotes can help prove, in this case, that college allows students to try a different career path until they find the one they're happy with. So again, a quote could come from, it could be a quote from a reading, it could be a quote from one of the articles from our library database, or it could be a quote from someone that you know, a friend, someone who's a non-expert. Last would be a scenario, and that's the last type of evidence. This is a what-if situation. So, for example, you say, suppose you got a 40-hour per week job that paid $10 an hour. Over the course of 1 year, that's a total of $19,200. If you could save half, $9,600, that could pay for a year of in-state tuition at many public four-year colleges. This scenario was used to prove that it's possible to save good money during a gap year. So you may want to use some sort of scenario. And again, that could come from common knowledge, something of your own, or even something from an outside library source. So when you're trying to find support for your reasons and you're using evidence to try to build your case, you can use these 5 types of evidence there. It's also important that you choose the right evidence. It says that when you are choosing evidence to support your argument, you want to make sure that it's relevant, sufficient, and credible. Relevant means that it actually supports the argument you're trying to make. It's on the same topic. You don't want to use a piece of evidence that's completely off topic. For example, if you're trying to convince your parents to let you stay out later than what their requirement is, you might argue that you're responsible and they can trust you to make good decisions. So an example of evidence or support that would not be relevant, if you're trying to convince them, you might say, hey, I walk the dog anytime you ask, so obviously I can be trusted. That's not relevant to whether you can stay out or not. Just because you can walk a dog when they tell you to doesn't mean you can be responsible for staying out late at night. But a relevant piece of evidence might say, hey, you've left me home on my own a few times and everything went fine. That proves that I'm trustworthy, and that might be a better argument there. Also, you want to look to make sure your evidence is sufficient. That means that there's enough evidence there to support the argument. If you're trying to convince your principal to make the school start time later, something that would not be sufficient, if you just say, hey, I can focus much better in my later classes, the principal's not going to change the start time of school just for you. That's not sufficient. But if you said a Northwestern study of over 2,000 students showed that student test scores rose by 10% because the schools moved to a start or late time, then that's more sufficient evidence because you're not just focusing on just your case, but the case of over 2,000 students. And then also the evidence needs to be credible. That means that needs to come from a reliable, unbiased source. This is where that crap sheet comes into play. For example, if I said, oh, the local association of farmers reports that locally grown vegetables have a higher vitamin content than those shipped to stores from across the country. Well, just because the people who farm here locally tell me that, it may be true, but I don't know if I can believe them because they're not the people in charge of determining vitamin content in an item. But if I said the USDA had reported that locally grown vegetables have a higher vitamin content than those shipped to stores, that's a little more credible because the USDA actually is in charge of determining vitamin content there. So for step 4, with choosing evidence, I want you to review the 2 to 3 reasons that you listed in your thesis statement. So if you said you had a counterclaim and then you gave your opinion on something, and then you said because X, Y, and Z, I want you to list your 3 reasons, reason X, reason Y, reason Z, and I want you to try to come up with evidence to support those reasons. The evidence, again, remember, we can go back up here to the chart. That can be a fact or a statistic, a story or an anecdote, an example, a quote, or a scenario. So you will use that to complete the chart in step 4.